In this video, I'm going to show you an Evo9 turbo that I converted into ball bearing, and I'm going to show you some of the machining processes on how it goes together. This is the turbo that I converted. This is a combination of parts. What you see here is this compressor housing is from Force Performance. I then took this compressor housing and I machined it out to an EF4 compressor wheel that MA Performance used to offer, which we now have because I ended up buying their CNC machine. So the compressor wheel is 60.27 by 82 millimeter. And that's a billet 7x7 blade compressor wheel. The turbine wheel we use is a TDO6H 9 blade turbine, so it's 58.8 by 67.2 millimeter. This turbo is good for around, well, it's good for over 600 horsepower, but realistically, not very many people make up to like 650. Here's a look at the ball bearing parts. This is a special piece to be able to screw down into the oil feed to connect right to the cage. So I have to drill the oil feed of the bearing housing out completely and then tap the thread all the way down to as far as I can go with it in the bearing housing. The thread pitch on the oil feed on this turbo is 12 millimeter by 1.25. So this is 12 millimeter by 1.25, so it can thread down in there. There's an Allen key fitting in the center of this that makes it so I can thread this down into the bearing housing. This threads all the way down into the bearing housing until it bottoms out onto the cage. So it just sits. It just threads all the way down in there and sits until it's tight onto the cage. I had a handful of these cages made. I'm not really sure how many exactly, but I do have a whole bag full of them. If you're interested in doing your own ball bearing turbo like I show in the video, then I don't mind selling you the parts to be able to do that, but it is your responsibility to do the machine work correctly if you want to do that. I bought these parts about 3 years ago and I just never messed with them. I thought it would be a cool upgrade to do, and I'll also share why I never messed with this a little bit later in the video. So a couple obstacles I went through with this turbo build that if you decide to do something like this yourself, or if you just want to know how it's built, well, a couple things I had to do was the thrust bearing has to be cut out to accept the ball bearing cage. So it actually has to get cut bigger than this. The thrust bearing has to be cut so that this whole cage will go all the way through it. This is one of the first ones I did. I miscalculated on this one, so I didn't use this one. The next thing I had to do was take this heat shield from an Evo9 and put it inside of the Evo10 heat shield as a spacer to be able to adjust the clearance for the turbine shaft to turbine housing out a little bit so that the turbine wheel wouldn't hit up against the turbine housing. Here's another ball bearing one that I did. So this one, you can see that there's a lot more clearance between the heat shield and the shaft. So the purpose of using these two heat shields is to move basically what we're trying to do is move the turbine shaft away from the turbine housing's radius. By using the two different heat shields, we then space out the bearing housing farther away from the turbine housing. Well, it really moves the whole center cartridge away from the turbine housing. The Evo9 heat shield is just a little bit thicker than what I needed it to be, so I had to machine it down from 37 thousandths down to 26 thousandths to be able to have the exact clearance for the turbine wheel to turbine housing tolerance as a journal bearing turbo. The reason this turbine wheel and shaft sits closer to the turbine housing is because of the way that the ball bearing cage sits in there. It's making it space out an extra 26 thousandths, so I had to compensate for that.